famous escape in history is over by chapter 15. The plagues, the last night in Egypt, the sea standing up on both sides, the army that goes into the gap and never comes out. All of it's finished a third of the way into the book. Israel is on the far shore singing before the ink is half spent. So what does Exodus do with the other 25 chapters? It builds a tent. 13 of the 40 chapters are taken up with a portable sanctuary. The dimensions, the fabric, the colors of the yarn, the weight of the gold, the exact number of loops on a curtain, and which side the rings go on. The book we name after a getaway spends more of itself on soft furnishings than on the getaway. That's the design, not padding. And the shape of the book is how the writer makes his case. Exodus is a story about an address. God rescues a people in the first act and moves in with them in the last. And every strange proportion in the book bends toward that ending. Once you can see it, the boring chapters stop being boring. So here are 7 things sitting in the second book of the Bible that most people walk straight past. Some are a single Hebrew word. One's a name the writer refuses to give you. The last is the final sentence of the book, and it's stranger than anything in the plagues. This is part 1. There's more than 7, and we'll get to the rest another time. Number 1. The name on the cover was somebody else's idea. Exodus is a Greek word. It comes from the same translation of the Hebrew scriptures that handed us the name Genesis, made in Egypt a couple of centuries before Jesus, for Jewish communities whose daily language had become Greek. Exodus means the way out, the road out, a going. It's a good name. It's also somebody else's name for the book, chosen by translators looking back at the story from a long way off. The people who lived closest to it called this scroll something different. In Hebrew, it's Shemot, which means names. That's how ancient scrolls were filed. You didn't print a title on a spine. You unrolled the first handspan, read the opening words, and those words became the name. Here's the opening line. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. So, the book of the Great Escape is called Names. That's a strange fit for a scroll like this one. The scroll that holds the sea, the mountain, the tablets, and the fire opens with a family register. 11 names and then a number. 70 people went down into Egypt. The choice is deliberate. Genesis had just spent its last chapters narrowing a whole world down to one family. Exodus opens by listing that family, one member at a time, before it lets them become a nation. The writer won't let you meet Israel as a crowd. You meet them as people with names, and the crowd grows around them. By verse 7, they're past counting. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. 70 names, then a population. That's the hinge of the first chapter, and it turns in 6 verses. Something about the shelf around it, since this is the second scroll of 5. Tradition assigns the whole set to Moses. The events sit in Egypt's New Kingdom period, somewhere in the 15th or the 13th century before Christ, depending on which reconstruction you follow. Historians argue about the date and about which ruler sat on the throne, and that argument has run for well over a century without settling. Genesis comes before this book, and Leviticus comes straight after, and the 5 were read as one long work. Hold on to that last part. It's going to matter enormously by the time we reach number 7. A scroll called Names then, which makes number 2 very strange, because there's one name it flatly refuses to write down. Egypt's king shows up in chapter 1 and stays on the page until the water closes over his army. He's the most powerful human being in the story. He owns the labor, the grain, the army, and the river. He gives the order that starts the whole plot. He's never named. Not once, in 40 chapters. He's the king of Egypt, or simply Pharaoh, which is a title rather than a name, the way the queen is a title. Egyptian kings carved their names into stone precisely so the names would outlast them. This scroll, the one actually called Names, declines to write his down. Now consider who does get a name in that same chapter. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 2 slave midwives, foreign women, near the bottom of the social order of the most stratified society on earth, working a job nobody wrote poetry about. The writer gives them both names and keeps them in the record permanently. Then he tells you what they did. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. They're the first people in the book to disobey Pharaoh, and it works. Before Moses is born, before the burning bush, before a single plague, the machine has already been jammed by two women who decided not to comply. The pattern holds when you keep reading. Chapter 2 brings in a Levite mother who hides her baby for 3 months, a sister who watches the basket from the reeds and speaks up at the right second, a daughter of Pharaoh who pulls the child out of the water and raises him inside the palace her own father runs. 3 more women who bend the story, and the writer leaves all 3 of them unnamed in that chapter. He named the midwives. There's one more turn of the knife. The baby who survives all this gets his name from the Egyptian princess, and Moses is an Egyptian name, the same element that sits inside royal names like Thutmose and Ramses. The deliverer of the Hebrews walks through the whole book carrying a name from the country he's dismantling, while the king of that country carries no name at all. The arithmetic isn't hard to follow. A throne gets a job title. The women who actually stop the killing get their names on the page forever. If you were building a scroll called Names, and you wanted a reader to work out what your God values, you could hardly do it more plainly. Which is why the writer never says it out loud. He files the story that way and trusts you to notice. Number 3. 4 words most people have never heard, welded onto 4 words everybody knows. Let my people go. That line's been sung, printed, painted, and quoted for centuries, and it usually stops right there. In the book, it almost never does. Nearly every time the demand reaches Pharaoh, a second half comes with it. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, "Let my people go, so that they may worship me." Go and worship. The demand reaches past an end to being owned, all the way to the question of who they belong to next. And in Hebrew, the 2 halves are the same word. The word is avad. It covers the whole range of serving, the labor a slave does for a master, and the service a worshiper brings to God. Israel's slavery in chapter 1 is avad. What God asks Pharaoh to release them for is avad. English needs 2 different words, so our Bibles print slave in one place and worship in the other, and the seam vanishes in translation. The Hebrew has no seam. It's one verb the whole way through. The question driving the book was never whether Israel would serve, it's who. That reframes the plagues considerably. This isn't a labor dispute, it's a custody argument between 2 masters, conducted in public, and the loser is the one whose claim turns out to be counterfeit. It also tells you what the plagues were aimed at. On the night of the Passover, God says what he's doing, and the sentence goes past Pharaoh entirely. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. The river, the sun, the livestock, the health of the firstborn heir. Each of those sat under the care of a named Egyptian god. All of them fail in public, in front of the whole country, over 10 rounds. Be careful with that, because it gets pushed too far. You'll find charts online matching each plague to one specific Egyptian deity, and those pairings are mostly modern guesswork rather than anything the Bible states. The claim in the book is broader and steadier. The gods of Egypt are being judged, all of them, and the argument gets settled in the only arena that mattered to an ancient audience, which is the weather, the water, and the crops. The same root shows up again when God introduces himself at the mountain. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That last phrase is built from the same word, the house of servants. He names the place by the kind of service it demanded, then starts describing the kind he has in mind instead. It also explains a detail that seems petty when you first meet it. Pharaoh keeps offering partial deals. Worship, but stay inside the country. Worship, but leave the children behind. Worship, but leave the livestock. Every offer keeps a hand on some part of them, because a master who still has a hand on any part of you has not actually let go. Moses turns down every version, and the reason is exact. Nobody can tell in advance which animal will be needed for the offering, so all of it goes. Here's what that old service looked like, and it's worth a moment because the word's doing real work. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. Mud dug from the riverbank, mixed with chopped straw for strength, pressed into wooden molds and dried in the sun. Egyptian foremen kept a daily count, and we found their tallies scratched onto broken pottery. Quota met or quota short. That was the old service. Measured, counted, never finished. The new service gets measured too. There'll be a calendar, a set of festivals, a portion, a rhythm. Even the year restarts. On the night of the Passover, God tells them, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year." A new master, and time itself begins again from the day he takes over. The difference lands on who's doing the asking, and the second half of the book spends 13 chapters showing you what the new one is like to live with. Quick word before we continue. If this is opening something up for you, hit subscribe so the next part actually reaches you. And if you want to go further than that, you can support the channel by becoming a member. That's what keeps the research, the writing, and the production going. And it's what keeps all of it free for anyone who wants to sit down and study. To everyone already supporting, thank you. These keep coming because of you. Right. The next one surprises people more than anything else in this book. Number 4. You can measure with your own thumb on the page. Count the chapters. Egypt, the plagues, the last night, the sea, the song on the far shore, 1 to 15. The wilderness and the mountain, 16 to 24. Then a tent, from 25 to the end, interrupted once. 13 chapters on the sanctuary, 15 on getting out of Egypt. Every film made of this story ends at the water. The book treats the water as the first act. This is exactly where most readers slow down and start skimming, and it feels like the book has lost its nerve. The opposite is true. It's arrived at the thing it was walking toward the whole time, and it tells you so in one sentence, right as the blueprints begin. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. That's the commission for the entire second half, and the verb gives it away. Dwell, settle in, live at this address. Trace what's happened across the book to make that sentence possible. In chapter 1, God's people are property in somebody else's country. By chapter 40, God has an address in the middle of their camp, a tent pitched at the center, the tribes arranged around it in order. The story travels from a labor camp to a neighborhood. A portable sanctuary is also a strange thing to want. Every other nation in that world built temples out of stone, on the assumption that a god belongs to a place. If you move, the god stays behind with the building. This one gets built out of poles and fabric and dyed skins. Everything is made in a specific order, so the whole structure comes apart in an afternoon and travels on the shoulders of the people it belongs to. That design decision is the theology. A God who intends to move house whenever you do needs a house that folds. There's a second thing hiding in the placement. The tent goes in the middle, and the 12 tribes camp around it on 4 sides. Not on a hill above them. Not out at the edge where the holy things are kept away from ordinary life. The most dangerous object in the camp sits in the center of the neighborhood, where children run past it every day. So the curtain measurements are the part where the rescue turns into a residence. The writer hands them 13 chapters because that's the ratio he wants sitting in your head when you close the scroll. Number 5 is a repetition so large that readers assume somebody made a mistake. Chapters 25 through 31 are the plans. God tells Moses what to build, in detail, down to the sockets and the clasps. Chapters 35 through 40 are the construction. It's the same material again, the same items in the same order, with the verbs changed from make to made. Curtains, frames, veil, ark, table, lampstand, altar, court, garments. Given, then built. Twice through at nearly identical length. On any modern editor's desk, this gets cut in half. Nobody prints the plan and the finished job side by side. But this is how ancient royal building accounts were written, and the repetition carries the message. What was commanded is what was made, item for item, nothing added and nothing quietly left out. Which is exactly why the thing sitting between the two halves lands the way it does. Chapters 32 to 34. The golden calf. The plans have been given. The build hasn't started. Moses is up the mountain, out of sight for 40 days, and the people at the bottom decide they need something they can see. They bring their gold. They make a god. They hold a festival for it. Look at the placement. The writer could have put that story anywhere. He wedges it into the exact gap between the design and the construction, so the reader meets Israel's worst failure while holding God's house plans in their hands. There's a detail in it most readers skate past. When the calf is finished, the people don't announce a god imported from somewhere else. They point at the statue and credit it with bringing them up out of Egypt. Aaron builds an altar in front of it and calls a festival to the Lord by name. They're trying to get the right god into a shape they can manage, on a schedule they control. Nobody in that crowd thinks they've changed religions, and that's a different failure from idolatry, as most people picture that word. The homemade version is far more common. What follows is the part that makes the repetition land. Moses goes back up and argues for them. The tablets get cut a second time. God passes in front of him and describes himself out loud as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. That description arrives immediately after the worst thing these people ever do, which is precisely where it means something. And when the building finally starts, something happens that nobody expects from this crowd. The material comes in faster than the craftsman can use it. The workers have to down tools and go to Moses about it, and he issues the only order of its kind in Scripture. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. The people had to be told to stop giving because what they'd already brought was more than enough for the whole job. Same camp, same jewelry, a few chapters apart. Then 35 to 40 roll on, and the tent gets built anyway, after the calf. Out of gold given by the same hands, carried in by the same people, some of whom had handed over gold for the statue a few weeks earlier. So the repetition that looks like a copying error is the shape of the mercy. The plan survived the failure, unchanged, item for item. If the tent is where the book is going, then number 6 is the language it gets built in, and that language will sound familiar. The building plans in chapters 25 to 31 arrive as 7 separate speeches. Each one opens the same way, with the Lord speaking to Moses, and you can count the openings yourself. 7 distinct sections, marked out by the same phrase every time. The 7th one is about the Sabbath. The final speech in the building plans leaves carpentry behind altogether. It's the command to keep the 7th day, given right at the end of the plans, as the last word on how to build a house for God. If that rhythm feels like something you've read before, it is. Genesis chapter 1 runs in the same shape. God speaks, things come into being, and the 7th unit is a day set apart and made holy. The echoes keep coming. When the sanctuary work is done, the writer says, "So all the work on the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was completed." Genesis says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." When the last piece goes in, "And so Moses finished the work." Genesis, by the 7th day God had finished the work he had been doing. Then Moses inspects everything and blesses the people, which is what God does at the close of the creation week. Same verbs, same order, same ending on a blessing. Hebrew scholars have pointed at this pattern for a long time, and what they draw from it is modest and enormous at the same time. The tabernacle is being described as a world in miniature, a small, ordered space, made the way the big one was made, where God and people are in the same room again the way they were at the beginning. So the second half of Exodus is Genesis chapter 1 rebuilt out of fabric and gold. Built by people this time, on purpose, with the 7th day sitting at the end of the blueprint exactly where it sits at the end of the week. There's a nice detail in who does the building. The craftsmen get named, and the book says God filled one of them with his spirit, with wisdom and understanding and knowledge and skill. That's the first time in Scripture anyone is described as filled with the Spirit of God, and the job it's given for is metalwork, carpentry, and weaving. One caution before we move on, because this is ground where people push far too far. What sits on the page is shared vocabulary and shared structure, and that's strong enough on its own. No hidden code is required here, and none is being claimed. The writer is using the plainest tool a writer has, which is repetition, and he's using it in the open where anyone can check him. Number 7 is the last sentence of the book, and everything so far has been walking toward it. Everything's finished. The tent stands, the courtyard's up, every clasp is in place, the priests are dressed, and the writer has just told you Moses completed the work exactly as commanded. Then the presence arrives. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That second sentence is the one to slow down on. The man who received the plans, supervised the build, inspected the work and blessed the people, can't get through the door of the building he just put up. The book named The Way Out ends with a man who can't get in. That's the last real event in Exodus. What follows is a short note about how the camp would travel from then on. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out. No calendar, no route planned in advance, no departure date anybody could write down. They moved when the cloud moved, and they stayed when it stayed, for 40 years. That's the last practical instruction the book gives, and then the scroll runs out. No resolution, no ceremony. The house is full, and the householder's own servant is standing outside it. The book treats that as the problem the rescue produced, rather than as a defeat. God has moved in, exactly as promised. Now a holy presence sits in the middle of a camp full of ordinary people, and the practical question arrives immediately. How is anybody supposed to live next door to that and survive it? Exodus doesn't answer, it stops. And the next scroll opens with this. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. The voice comes from inside. The man who couldn't enter gets called. Whatever the answer turns out to be, it starts with an invitation issued from the room he couldn't walk into. The whole next book is that answer, working out how a people lives beside a presence without being consumed by it, which is why the 5 scrolls were read as one work. That's the ending Exodus was engineered for. A door and a voice on the other side of it.
Line the 7 up, and the design stops being arguable. A book of escape whose real name is names. A king with no name and 2 midwives with theirs. A demand that always came in 2 halves. A getaway finished at the 1/3 mark. A blueprint printed twice with a disaster wedged between. A tent raised in the language of creation. A last page where the presence arrives and the door won't open yet. A book only comes out that way on purpose. 7, and the list is done. Number 7 has an echo though, and it lands a long way from Sinai. Centuries later, a writer sat down to open his account of Jesus and reached for this exact ending. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The wording underneath that phrase is the language of pitching a tent, of setting up the portable sanctuary. He's naming the tabernacle on purpose and putting a person where the tent used to stand, which goes a long way past a general remark about God being close by. That lands directly on the problem Exodus stopped at. A presence had arrived and nobody could go in. The answer when it came, walked around in a body, ate with people, touched the ones nobody else would touch, and got approached all day long by anyone who wanted to. The tent that no one could enter learned how to come out. If you ever got out of something and still don't feel free, this book has been describing you for 4 chapters. The people in this book leave Egypt in a single night, then spend the rest of their lives learning what to do with the freedom. 40 days without a visible leader, and they were pooling their jewelry to build something else to answer to. Getting out was the fast part. Being unowned took much longer, and some of them never managed it at all. That's worth knowing if you've ever left something that was eating you alive and then noticed the space it left behind. The job, the relationship, the habit, the debt, the fear of what one particular person thinks of you. The thing ends, and inside a month, something else has quietly moved into the same slot and started issuing quotas. Exodus is honest about that pattern, and it doesn't shame anybody for it. Its answer is an address rather than more willpower. A God who refuses to rescue people and then leave them to manage on their own. He moves into the middle of the camp and stays there while they work it out, badly, for 40 years. The serving never stopped, it changed hands. And the new master built his house so it could travel, because he had no intention of being somewhere you weren't. Notice what the book does with the timeline, too. Nobody in that camp got a schedule. They watched a cloud, and they moved when it moved, and the waiting between moves was most of their lives. If you're in a stretch where nothing is lifting, the book has already described your situation. And it doesn't call it failure, it calls it traveling. The part of this book that stays with me is the arithmetic. Exodus gives 13 chapters to a tent because the tent answers the question the plagues raised. A God who can flatten an empire could have been a God who rescues from a distance and then moves on. This one asked for fabric and thread and a specific shade of blue,
and set up in the middle of the camp where the noise was. Every piece of that sits in the open. The names are in chapter 1. The unnamed king is on every page. The second half of the demand sits in every round of the argument. The measurements are printed in your Bible in English, and the last sentence is right there where the book stops. It only takes reading it as one built thing instead of a highlight reel with a long appendix.